All right, why don't we get started? Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name's David DeMont. I'm with Samy's Camera, and welcome to day 6 of our Samy's Photo School Holiday Education event. And we are finishing off a great day today with our friends from the Panasonic Lumix team. We've got Panasonic Pete, we've got Mark Toll, and we've got the impressive Michael Richardson joining us tonight. And we're got a great presentation coming your way on time warp and time lapse photography. Very, very exciting. Before we get started, again, I want to thank you for joining us and remind you all, Samy's camera stores are open. We are practicing all social distancing protocols for in-store shopping. We have touchless curbside pickup available for those of you who are interested in that service. And as always, we are 24/7 on Samys.com for all of your holiday and photographic needs this season. We've got some great deals on Panasonic Lumix cameras and lenses and accessories going on. The guys will be sharing a little bit of that information a little later in the presentation. But I just want to welcome you all again, and thanks to the team from Panasonic. And Michael, turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to have to step up to that fantastic introduction. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I got to work on that one now. Wow.
You'll live up to it. I have no doubt.
I know. No worries. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm so glad and happy that Samy's allow us to present. I love teaching these different topics. So thank you again for allowing us as the Panasonic team to come in tonight and go over some topics for you. Give me a second here. What I want to do is pin my video so that you can see me. And then I'm going to introduce Mark Toll. Mark is my compatriot up in the Portland area. He is also a shooter of time lapse, so we'll be sharing some of his images. He loves shooting time lapse, so he's going to be adding a lot to tonight's presentation. So, Mark, you want to take it away for a second and just say hi?
Yeah. So again, I'm Mark. I'm here from rainy Portland, and again, I've been shooting time lapse for about 5 years since Panasonic started putting it in their cameras. And anyways, we hope we can introduce you to a new topic tonight.
Fantastic. And then I'm going to also introduce Peter Preston. He is the salesperson who supports Samy's Camera. And Pete, you want to add anything to us today? You got some specials going on? We talked about some things earlier.
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. And thank you to Samy's for allowing us to do this. Thank you, Mike and Mark, for helping out. I am the sales guy, so here's my sales pitch. Use your cameras, have fun, enjoy life. And if you do enjoy time lapse, Panasonic cameras are the easiest cameras to use for time lapse. I'm a sales guy. I use time lapse all the time. I did an 8-hour project and putting in a new lawn. And of course, it looks like I did it in about a minute. So that made me look really good. Samy's Camera has their holiday sales event. Everything is no tax. So if you're interested in a Panasonic camera, go to their website. They've got all sorts of added bundles like free bags, free cards, free hard drives, a bunch of good stuff. So Mike, back to you.
And again, thank you so much, Pete. I greatly appreciate it. We're going to start this off with Time Warp, my new class that I want to talk about, mastering the illusion of time travel. So tonight we're going to talk about taking a variety of images and putting them together in kind of a video form and creating those things that we know known as time lapse. And then we're going to also introduce a few other ways of doing it. So first of all, I kind of want to just kind of talk about a few things here. I have Mark and Pete here monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions or you need anything answered while we're doing the presentation today, if you would drop into the chat, I would greatly appreciate that you would drop in and ask any questions that you need to in the chat room there. And Pete will either answer them or bring them up to us in the group and we can discuss them. Or if we have time, we will cover them for you at the end. So that's the best bet. The other thing I would like to add is if you're having trouble with audio or video, best bet is to drop off, log out, and then log back in. So let's get into mastering the illusion of time travel. Get your keys for your DeLorean, your flux capacitor, and there's my little bit to Back to the Future, and we'll talk about time lapse. So time lapse is a photography technique whereby the frequency at which film frames are captured is much more spread out than the frequency used to view the sequence. When played at normal speed, time appears to be moving faster and thus lapsing. That is kind of the basics of time lapse. Now, we talked about how easy, and Pete mentioned how easy it is to do this on a Panasonic camera, but I want to talk tonight that it's not just a Panasonic camera that you can do this with. You can do this with a camera from any manufacturer. What time lapse really is a series of images or a series of pictures put together into a video form that makes it look like we talked, makes time speed up. So Mr. Toll had this great video image of some clouds moving. So let me start playing that. And you can kind of see how this exposure goes and how the motion of the image makes time kind of stand still or move faster or quicker. And you can see the light change and the clouds moving. Mark, you want to talk about this image? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, this is the first one I ever shot, and this was taken over about a 2-hour time period up in Reno of the sun setting. And Mike's going to talk about techniques and things, but basically I shot this one full auto, just set the camera on a tripod, set the time lapse, and just let it shoot, and then we're going to show you how it makes the video in the camera.
We'll go over how easy this is to do with the Panasonic, of course, but as I mentioned, it's not something that has to be done exclusively with the Panasonic. There are a lot of other software, packages that you can purchase that will allow you to take a series of images, put them together, and assemble them into a time-lapse movie. Here's another version of one of Mark's favorites up in the Seattle area, the Space Needle.
Yeah, this one I shot out the window of the hotel room. And again, I set the camera up and let it shoot while I went out to dinner and came back, and this is my result. This was this out the back of the hotel, same hotel. And again, another sunset. You can see planes in the sky there. You can see the lights come on in the windows. And again, both of them were over about a 2-hour period.
What we're going to talk about tonight is how simple this is to set up and kind of what you need to do for some exposures. I love this one, Mark.
I know everybody loves this one. This was, I basically bolted the camera to one of these poles. The deck railing while I coated the deck. And again, this was probably over only about maybe a 20 or 30 minute period.
So taking that amount of time, speeding it up, playing it back at a different frame rate, and giving you great choices and seeing what you can do with it. This was a church in my neighborhood that they were tearing down, so I ran up on the roof and put my camera on a tripod, and you can see as it moves across, they just kind of take the building on down and remove the trees. Again, speeding up time. This is probably a period of, maybe 3 hours. And you can just see that cool little caterpillar making its way across the building, and the people moving all nice and quickly. Traffic going by super fast. Now this is what we call time lapse. Again, a lapse of time that makes it look like the time frame is going faster than really is, or faster than reality. It's a great way to document something that's happening or create something that's interesting where maybe you might have had something that wasn't quite so interesting. I like to do it if I'm at the beach or something and I see a sunset that doesn't seem to be that magical. Then sometimes it's great to, rather than taking a still image, taking a time lapse and putting together a nice image of the clouds moving across and the sun dropping down, maybe some sailboats going across, things like that. Again, taking time and compressing it. I'm going to zip through a little bit faster here. There we go. They take the tree down. They take the next one down. Just incredible how fast this happened, but how easy this is to do. And we're going to go through step by step how I actually did this and how all these time lapses are created and how simple they can be. The beauty of this is, as long as you have some disk space and your battery power, it's pretty much automatic, and there's really not that much to have to worry about. When we were teaching classes in Samys, here's a way to compress time. Here's my 1 hour class in about 15 seconds. Boom, 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 as we go through, just teaching tips and tricks. So when we get back to maybe a non-COVID society and I'm back teaching classes in the Sammy stores, feel free to join in on one of my tips and tricks classes, or of course, look into any one of the classes that we do online like tonight. We occasionally do a variety of different topics. Now, this is what I talked about. A sunset. This is in Hawaii. I was on my balcony watching the sunset. It's just really not that impressive. But the clouds were moving and looking kind of neat. So I decided to just take my LX100, put it on the railing with a Gorilla Pod that I got at Samy's, and set the camera up and said, go to town. And it takes care of everything for you. It shoots the 300 images. And then it also automatically puts them together in the video file. So then all I have to do at the end is transfer that video file over, and away I go. It just makes this so easy to do. And then as you see, it's now changing, the sky's changing color. The lights are starting to go on in the foreground. It just can take kind of a nonchalant, not fantastic sunset, even if you see some rain going on there, and kind of create a really interesting file. Again, the same thing. This is a different day from a balcony again in Hawaii. And the fun part of this is then seeing how the whole foreground wakes up as the lights come on at night. Again, compressing time, very easy to do. All I have to do is tell the camera how many images I want, what the duration is in between those images. And then I'll talk about how I set the camera up so that we get a fluid image, so that it's not changing a lot. And I'll even show you something that I did this morning where I did it at 1 frame rate versus another, and you can see where it's jumpy at one and then it's not jumpy at another, and you can get kind of a good idea of where we're at. I noticed somebody put in the chat about will they be able to see these later, or can you catch even like my black and white class? Yes, I believe Samys has been recording these, and I believe they will follow up with you later in the week with a follow-up email, and in that email should be a link for the recordings. Or you can always reach out to Samy's Education Photo School, and I'm sure I'm more than happy to provide you with the link for tonight's recording, as well as...
Yeah, Michael, we'll be sending an email out at the end of the event with the links to the various recordings we've been making.
Thank you very much. So if you didn't get a note, didn't get something that you needed to write down, no problem, you can catch it later. Now, this is what I've been working with lately. I've been enjoying this. We've now talked about time lapse. Now, the next one that we like to talk about is hyperlapse. Hyperlapse is a time lapse where we move the camera through the subject. So we'll read this now. Hyperlapse, or moving time lapse, is a technique in time lapse photography creating motion shots. It is the simplest form. A hyperlapse is achieved by moving the camera a short distance between each shot, basically moving the camera through the subject. The first film using the hyperlapse technique dates back to way back to 1995. So this is kind of a new technique in the world of photography as far as I'm concerned. I've been doing photography for over 40 years. So 1995 is for me. I've been doing stuff a long time longer than that. But hyperlapse is quite different in where time lapse, the cameras, if you'll notice in all those other images that we looked at, all these are basically on a tripod or are bolted to a railing or put up on maybe a windowsill, and the camera stays steady in one position. And so it does not move. Hyperlapse is now taking the same type of thing, taking a series of images, combining them into a movie, and moving the camera through the subject. So I was in downtown LA late one night. I was working with the brand new S5, which has an incredible high ISO capability because of its dual native ISO capability. So I had just finished shooting some images at Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and I thought, you know, what if I took my camera, put it on the dashboard of my car at ISO 5000 wide open at 2 frames a second, and I drove 30 miles an hour down the streets? What would I get? Well, this is what happened. I got what's called a hyperlapse. So it drives through the city, and then we go for the tunnel. And I also shot this in black and white just to give it that kind of more, I guess, grittier downtown look. And we can do that by just changing the picture profile in camera. So this is called a hyperlapse. Allows us to move the camera through the subject and give us a different viewpoint, as well as different from a time lapse. One of my favorite places is Newport Beach. I love the old ferry there that's been there for 100 years. So longer than I've been doing photography. And again, put it on my dashboard, set it to 2 frames. Actually, this time is 5 frames a second. And we're going to go for a ride. And again, watch the Ferris wheel, watch the boats. Everything is sped up in time. And we kind of go for a little tour. Look at all the people moving nice and fast like ants. The cars move really fast. We go up onto the ferry. Lady says stop so I don't drive into the water. You can see the other ferry coming across on the left. And then off we go. My camera is set in manual focus so that focus does not change. I'm set in auto ISO so that any fluctuations in light, of course we had no clouds at this point, so I don't really have to worry about that too much. And I'm at 5 frames per second. Kind of a cool thing. And here we come up to the island now. We've gone from Balboa to Balboa Island. Now we're going to drive the little narrow streets on the island and go across over on the bridge. If you've ever done it, it's a neat little place to go. But again, it was a cool example for hyperlapse. You can see how we just kind of move through the streets. Everything moves nice and quick. You can see the traffic sped up, people running across. And one of the keys to this is image stabilization. These examples so far are using in-camera stabilization on a Panasonic S5. There is nothing going on as far as any form of gimbal or any form of other support. I literally just took a small, little, tiny, flat tripod, put it on my dashboard of my car. I'm shooting through the windshield, which is dirty. My camera, I mentioned, is in manual focus, so that there are no changes to the focus as we're doing this. I'm in auto ISO. My exposure is set to manual so that there is no adjustment of the aperture. And we'll talk a little bit more about reasons why that is. So I set my exposure on the car as I'm doing it and then kind of let it fly and very cautiously drive 25 miles an hour through the residential streets, trying not to stop too fast. But the beauty of this is, you notice, even on the bumpy streets of this little island, it's pretty smooth. So that is a great thing about image stabilization in body, and one of the things that Panasonic and our entire line is really well known for. There's only a few cameras now in our lineup currently that do not have in-body stabilization. But if you're familiar with GH5, G9, any of the S series, the 5-axis image stabilization is not only outstanding, I believe it's second to none, and pretty much everybody else kind of wants to copy it. And here's another sample. This is Oak Glen. Again, putting the camera and running through the subject, or driving the road, taking the winding road, and speeding up that time by taking this at 5 frames per second. And again, these are all built in camera. I'm not doing any editing to this. I'm not putting it in a separate piece of software. I basically end up, once my time lapse is done, the camera literally asks me, do I want to build the file? I tell it yes, and away we go. It is really, really simple to do. I don't think I can explain how fast and how simple. You want to drive the 91 freeway late at night at sunset. Here's another perfect example. If any of you are California Highway Patrol officers, I did not break any laws. I did my best. Again, compressing time, great exposure, set my exposure, use auto ISO. So if there is any change in light, the ISO is what's going to make the change so that it stays completely fluid. So you can see I've got headlights coming at me. I've got taillights on and off. I've got a sky changing in this respect. And the auto ISO is making any changes for the fluctuation in light so that I don't get any flicker from these frames. And again, image stabilization in camera. The in-camera stabilization is keeping this nice and smooth. If you've ever driven the 91, it too is bumpy. Not quite as much as the Newport area, but Pretty cool. So easy and so simple to do. These are all called hyperlapses because we are moving through the subject. Now let's talk about one more surprise, and that is a motion lapse. Now, motion lapse is the next step. Motion lapse is similar to a hyperlapse or moving time lapse, and it is a technique in time-lapse photography for creating motion shots. In its simplest form, incorporating either a pan or tilt move during the exposure or a combination of both. Rather than moving through the subject, a motion lapse is used to cover large expansive spaces or subjects, basically moving the camera across the subject. Ooh, I just noticed I got a typo there. I'm gonna have to fix that. Anyways, what we did here is this afternoon, I was in downtown LA. I'm gonna show you this one first. And what I am doing here is using a Air 2 gimbal, and that gimbal is making the movement for me. Now I'm doing the release of the camera via the camera, not via the gimbal. So the gimbal is making the movement. So I'm able to actually take the app from the gimbal and tell it where I want it to start, looking up, and I'm gonna want the camera now to pan to the right and pan down. And so you're gonna now see as it goes. What I did is I built this file. Let's see, I shot this at a 1 second interval. We shot 300 images, and I wanted it to complete at the end. But when I built the file, I built this file at 7.5 images. And you'll notice, or 7.5 frames a second. And you'll notice it's a little jumpy. 7.5 has a little bit of jump to it. So you can kind of see where each individual frame is now kind of showing some little bit of flicker. I won't say flicker, but kind of stepping motion, I guess we'll call it. So then I went back to the same files. I did not have to go back and reshoot it. So I took those files then in camera after I told it to build at 7.5 frames a second. And I said, build me the same exact images, take those 300 images and build them now at 15 frames per second. And now look how smooth it is. So much nicer. So now we are taking a time lapse. You can see the car is moving super quick. This is a 2 second interval in between. I'll play this again for you. So not only are we doing our time lapse, but at the same time now we are moving the camera from left to right, and we are moving the camera from up to down. So we are doing a pan and a tilt. Thus we call this a motion lapse, and changing the way in which time is looked at by changing the perspective as well as the time frame of that. Now I built this at 1080 at 15 frames per second is the playback speed. And then I can also play this back at 4K. I can build it at 30 frames per second. I can build it at less, but just to go back, here's the first one. And you can kind of see, if you look really carefully, how it tends to step. You can see the difference between frame to frame to frame to frame to frame. Whereas if we go to the next version, at 15 frames per second, it is much, much smoother. Now, just so to give you a little bit of education, if you're not a video or a cinema person, 24 frames per second is the standard for what you see generally for motion pictures. So at 24 per second, that gives you the quote cinematic look, gives you that smoothness to it. If you're shooting subjects that move fast, such as sports or something that has a lot of movement in it, that's when people then go to that 30 frames per second rule. Or you can go to 60 frames per second. A lot of our cameras even give you 4K 60 or 4K 30. If you record at 1080 60 or 4K 60, if you're shooting video, that is if you have something or a subject that has a lot of motion to it so that you can stop that motion. So let's look at tips for successful time travel, or my tips for successful use of doing time lapse. Manual exposure mode. In other words, we want that exposure to be consistent. I've shown you time lapses that are all pretty short in duration. They are maybe done in 15 minutes. They're maybe done in 12 minutes, maybe done in 10 minutes. A lot of them are not hours and hours long. A lot of time lapses that people do are for a super, super length of time. I think Pete mentioned that he did his lawn and they did like a 3-hour version. So my tip for success to give you the best is to work with manual exposure mode so that there are no changes to the shutter or the aperture. And the reason for aperture is this. If every single time that the camera is taking the exposure, it's shutting the aperture down to a certain f-stop, that f-stop may not be exactly accurate every single time. So what we want to do is put it in manual so those aperture blades are not opening and closing throughout every exposure. Because if they do that, you may be f4.0.5 in one and f3.95 or 3.86. There may be a little fluctuation every time that shutter, or sorry, the aperture opens and closes. So by putting it on manual exposure mode, you are keeping the aperture of the lens consistent, thus giving you a very, very good basis all the way across so that all your frames don't, what we call blink, or you can see a brightness and a darkness, brightness and a darkness. Manual focus mode, again, the same thing. As your camera focus is different, exposure can change as well. So you want to keep that manual focus exactly where it is. So you don't want it auto-focusing, or maybe it catches something else. A bird flies by and it may pick up something foreground rather than background. You want to keep it consistent all the way through the length of your time lapse or your time travel. And so by going manual exposure mode and manual focus mode, that will keep that consistent, because consistency here is the key. And then we mentioned it before, auto ISO. If you put your camera into auto ISO, let the ISO be the fluctuation for changing any change in light. So maybe you have like the clouds that we had where they're going by the sun and your subject is getting bright at some points and dark at others. The concept here is to have auto ISO make all those corrections for you, because that's pretty much a consistent thing. It's not a mechanical thing that will be different. It's electronic. You're going to know that it's going to be pretty consistent all the way across. Probably the biggest key I can give anybody working with these is having a fully charged battery or extra batteries. The way in which the Panasonic works is that if you do run into out of battery power, it will actually go in a pause mode. If you pull the battery out and put another battery in and you restart your time lapse at that point, it will actually do that, which I think is really great. But of course, if you're going to have a very, very long exposure or a very long time lapse, maybe 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours, I suggest working with either an AC power supply and powering through a separate battery so that you can basically provide consistent and constant power to the camera rather than swapping batteries out all the time. And the biggest key is a stable platform. Whether it's a tripod or a rock or whatever you're using, a flat tripod on your dashboard of your car, or a tripod out there, or working with a gimbal and doing a motion lapse. The gimbal that I used, I put it on a tripod and all the motions were done with the stability of the gimbal. So great, and probably one of the best tips for successful time travel in doing hyperlapses or time lapses. I'm going to take a little break here real quick, and I'm going to see, do we have any questions that we need to answer, or how are we doing, Mark, on questions?
We have several questions. If it might be a good place to take these. Okay, so let me start up here. So somebody asked if stabilization should be on or off while you're doing the hyperlapses or the time lapses.
Hyperlapses, I've been leaving it on because, of course, you're moving through the subject, so you want stabilization to be on. I rarely ever turn stabilization off. There are those that like to turn it off if it's on sticks or on a tripod, but generally I leave it on at all times.
Do you need a super big SD memory card to store the multiple images and the movie?
Well, you should be. The movies usually aren't built that big in case you're doing, unless you're doing the 4K ones. But again, I've got 64 gigabyte cards and I have no problem whatsoever. In fact, all the ones that I've shown you pretty much are all on one SD card. So you should have no problem with that whatsoever. Everything is shot in Jpeg. So it's already a compressed file.
Do you shoot RAW or JPEG?
I shoot Jpeg.
Yep, I agree.
Because the time lapse
Yeah.
program uses in camera uses JPEG files. Now, if you wanted to use, say, a third-party software, you could take the time needed to do a lot of retouching or a lot of exposure changes. Maybe you have a very complex lit situation where the lighting is changing all over and color balances may change. In that respect, then you could maybe shoot raw files and then take those independent raw files and put them into Lightroom and then into a third-party program to produce your final movie at that point.
Another question. So how do you make the change to the frame rate after you already built the video at a lower frame rate?
Woohoo!
I'm not sure how to make these changes in a GH5S.
No problem. I will go over that. We're gonna get into that as we go a little bit about actually how we set the camera.
Okay,
so I will cover that.
Couple other real quick.
Though.
Yeah, a lot of good questions. Is there an app that allows you to ramp the interval rate up or down during the time lapse?
No, not that I'm aware of.
No, our app doesn't allow that.
Yeah, once you're in, you're in. So if there is something that you need to change, then at that point, cancel and restart. I guess that probably answers it.
A focus question, manual focus. What do you focus on or when you're moving? The far dock, the car in front of you, a boat on the water? It seems all different. Or do you set an f-stop, a higher f-stop number so everything is in focus?
I'm using a higher f-stop so that I kind of get an idea of what I'm working with. You'll also notice that a lot of my stuff has been shot with pretty wide angles. So a lot of the things you saw were shot with a 16 millimeter, 16 to 35 on an S5. And so at 16 millimeter, we've got a lot of depth of field anyways. So if you've got something, say for instance, the boat shot, let's run back over here and literally focused on the sign, which is probably 50 feet in front of me. And the majority of everything there is 50 feet. But if you look, the dog in the foreground is sharp. The hood of my car is probably not, but the buildings in the back are pretty sharp. I'm shooting this at probably, I think it was f8. So f8 at, 250th of a second, ISO 200 is giving me quite a bit of depth of field, especially at that focal length.
Okay, another one here. What is the shutter speed for the time lapse of the clouds and sky?
Ooh. So if we're going back to something like this, I'm working with a bright sun in this shot. So, it's wherever I'm at to try and stop whatever motion is going on, because I really don't want the clouds to blur. So I think I'm at 125th, maybe 250th on this one.
Okay. Let's see. Can you ask the camera to make a movie after the photos have taken, or do you have to start the session with the time-lapse settings?
Yes. So I can't take like a series of photos and go, oh, hey, I'd like to make a time lapse of that. I can go back and redo those images and make another time lapse, but you can't just like have a nice sunset shot and have a group of them and then decide you want to put them, at least in our camera, you can't necessarily take a group of 5 photos or 10 photos or 20 or 300 and tell the camera to do that unless it's been started time lapse.
You could, you have to
party software.
Yeah, exactly. You have to use third-party software. Okay, so sorry to interrupt, but that's all we've got for now. No. Yep, they're good questions, though.
Great questions. I love it.
Keep them coming.
I love stuff like that. That's what we're all about. That's what we're here to teach and learn today. All right, so let's zip through these. Where were we? All right, so we're going to talk about slow motion. This is another way of working with things, but taking the frame rate rather than slowing it down. Now we're going to speed up the frame rate. So before we were taking things at 5 frames a second, 10 frames per second, 2 frames a second, 1 frame a second, and creating speed. Now I'm going to slow things down. In other words, I'm going to go the opposite way. So here I am. This is a fountain at Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, 180 frames per second. When I play it back in a 24-second timeline, it looks like this. You can see now that I've slowed the water down rather than speeding it up. Another way to, quote, travel in time, as my little theme is for tonight. So this is another trick that we can do with a variety of our cameras, anywhere from 120 frames per second all the way up to 240 frames per second on a GH5S. The gentleman that mentioned he had a GH5S has the ability of going up to 240 frames per second. This is with an S5, again at ISO 5000, doing some tests of the high ISO capabilities, which is what's called dual native ISO. And then if we were to look at it shot at 30 frames per second, because the water is moving pretty fast at normal speed, it looks like this. Big difference. So having the ability to, again, time travel, and we'll go back to, and there's our slow motion, slowing time down and making it go in a very, very slow way rather than speeding time up. Another method of our, quote, time travel. Loads of fun. And then we'll go here again, normal speed, 30 frames per second. So photographed at 30 frames per second and played back at 30 frames per second. All at ISO 5000. Now, we'll get into stopping time here in a minute, but before I do that, I want to go back and talk about time lapse and look at about how simple this is to do. So I'm going to turn on this camera, and that is number 3. And we should get the menu system here. Actually, number 4. There we go. So I have a GH5 set up, and I am putting it in time lapse animation. So this is, I currently have my camera set in for time lapse. I have the ability to now, in a Panasonic GH5, as well as pretty much every single one of our cameras have this, from the point and shoot ZS 8, or yeah, to the 80s, to the 70s, to the LX100, LX100 Mark II, any of the ZS series, 300s, 1000, 2500, G7, G85, GX85, you name it. Pretty much all of our cameras have this time lapse function. And this is how easy it is to use. So I basically would set my normal exposure. We're going to say go in manual. So my camera would be in manual setting. Once I've got my exposure set, I'm going to go to time lapse animation. I'm going to tap that once by hitting the menu set button in the middle of the wheel. And it's saying, what mode do I want? Well, I actually can do time lapse, or I can do stop motion. And we haven't talked about stop motion yet, but we'll talk a little bit about it. This is kind of a perfect time, Christmas, to talk about stop motion. You probably have all seen the Rudolph, the Red-Nosed Reindeer show that's been on for years, and the Santa one where they have the, I guess they're like little puppets, and you move you take, yeah, claymation, there you go. And you take, you know, their arm, you move it a little bit, you take a shot, move their arm a little bit more, take a shot, move their arm a little bit more, take a shot. That is stop motion animation. But tonight, we're going to talk about time lapse. So I'm going to select time lapse shot. I'm going to tell it I want it to start now, which means I'm going to have it start right after, when I hit the shutter button, after I've set up all my parameters. But if I wanted to, say at sunset, I could tell it start at 6 o'clock at night, start at 8 o'clock at night, start at whatever time I want it to start, and the camera will start automatically. But for tonight, we're going to go back and make the start time now. And then here's what we talked about, interval. How many seconds or minutes between each frame? So the interesting thing I want to make sure everybody understands about this is it's not necessarily the time in between frames. It has to do with the exposure, the time it takes to process that exposure, especially if you're doing a long exposure, and the time it takes to write it. So let's say you have a 2-second exposure, you're shooting something at night, and your correct exposure is 2 seconds. Now you may have noise reduction turned on, it takes double that time for it to process the file. So you need 2 seconds for the file record, for the actual photograph to be taken. You need 2 seconds for it to process and add the noise reduction. And then you need a little bit of time for it, write it to the card. So if you were to set 2 seconds there and you had a 2-second exposure, it would have problems. You need to make sure you wouldn't get all the images that you wanted in the right succession. So you need to make sure that your interval is equal to at least twice of what your exposure is. So if you're out in the daytime and you're shooting 500th of a second, it's not that big of a problem. But if you're shooting a long exposure for each frame, then you need to worry about what that interval is. So make sure it's at least twice that so that you cover not only the exposure time, the processing time, but the write time. And that's what the interval is the entire 3 things all calculated together, not just the actual time in between each image. It includes all 3 of those things. So here right now, there's a 1 minute interval. We don't want 1 minute. Let's say we're going to go 5 seconds. And let's go down. And let's sell, we want 300 images. And you'll notice as I change this, it's now telling me when it's going to finish. So currently, with a 5-second interval and 300 images, it's not going to finish till 8:05 p.m. Oh, well, I don't need to go that long. So then you need to make changes. You either can change the number of images, or you can go back up and you can change that interval and make it shorter. Let's go 1 second in between. So now we're getting our 300 images at 1 second interval. And right there, you're going to notice that it's going to actually tell us now at this point, 300 images will finish at 7:45 p.m. And then I just tell it to set. Let's go back up to 3. Boom. And I've got my review what I've got. I want it to start now. I want it to start at 1 second interval. And I want that image count to be 300 images. And away I go. Now push my shutter. And it will now, as you can see up there at the top on the far right-hand side, I don't have a card in this camera. I just wanted to demo how to set up the menu. But you'll notice the time lapse function on the right-hand side of the frame says 301 images. And as it would actually go progress through this, it would literally start counting down. You would go 300 images, 299, 298. It tells you how many images are left. Great and so simple to do. Then let me grab my other camera over here, because while I started this, I actually shot a time lapse. So this camera, I'm going to switch my feed here. Hang on a second. So you will see now, in the midst of this camera is literally shooting. Let's go through, it's got 90 images right now. I'm going to cancel this. But just to give you an idea, it will count down and tell you exactly how many images are left. I'm going to do one thing here real quick. And now that we've got it stopped, and now I can go to my playback menu. And then from here, this would allow me then to build up my file. And give me the ability to do the playback and play back those images and set it all up. So that way I can set up exactly where I'm working from and play back all my images. So it's really simple to do. It's very easy to take the file, make everything that you need. And away we go. So let's talk about the next step here. So we've talked about how simple that is to set up. Now I'm going to do something else. We're going to talk about stopping time. Let me switch over to another camera. And we should now have this feed. And what I'm doing is I'm shooting the back of one camera with another. And let's get that in shot. There we go. Let's get our candle in focus. Our number 7. There it is. Everybody see that? You're seeing the back of an S5 shot with a GH5. So what I want to show you is how to stop time. And this is a feature also on all of our cameras. This is called 4K, 6K photo. If you have, again, any Panasonic camera, this is very easy to do. I'm going to light my candle. I have it set to 4K, 6K photo. I'm going to let there we go, let that little candle light up a little bit. Now, the beauty of this is I'm going to hold down my shutter button. It's going to take a series of images, and while I do that, I'm going to blow out the candle. There we go, and I'm going to let it go. Now, the reason I shot the back of the camera is I want you to see what these cool things do. If you've never done 4K, 6K photo, this is the beauty of it. I have a little touch screen down here at the bottom, and I have the ability to scrub through a whole group of thumbnails. And if I want to stop exactly where that candle may have been blown out, I can, there it is, you can see, there you go. I can scrub through and find that exact moment in time that I like. And let's see, where do we like it best? And find that exact frame. So this is shooting 60 frames per second. Maybe I like that one there. I like the way the flame flickers. Maybe I like it with a little bit of smoke coming off of it. Let's see what else we got. Scroll through. I think we had some smoke over here. There, it was still lit. There's the smoke. There's the flame. There we go. There's their smoke. So I can find the exact moment in time just by using 4K, 6K photo. And then when I find what I like and I save that image, I can say yes. Boom. I've now saved that image to my file, and that saved the individual image to my SD card, as well as all these other images. But I can process that one, and I can go back and say, oh, I want to do another. Boom, I like that one with the light, with the way the candle is flickering. So easy to do, so simple. That's the beauty of working with some of the features on Panasonic, is to make life so simple to do and so easy to work with. Just like time lapse, you can make time go by super fast, or you can actually stop time and do that as well, and stop the exact moment in time when you would want to do that. So we're about 10 minutes to the top of the hour. I want to say thank you to Samy's camera for allowing me to present tonight. Let's go back to there. There we go. My information, I'm Michael Richardson. I'm the Southern California Sales Support Representative for Panasonic. If you ever want to get in touch with me or ask me a question, feel free to do so. You can give me a ring at 310-386-9154, or you can always shoot me an email, michael.richardson, my first name and my last name with a dot in between it, at us.panasonic.com. You can also find me on Instagram at mirrorless_Mike, or Mike at Lumix. Look forward to some new classes coming up in 2021. We do a group called Lumix University. We did Photo 101 and 102 earlier this year. It was very well attended. Everybody really enjoyed it. So we're going to introduce Video 101 and Video 102 in January and March, and we're going to repeat Photo 101 and 102 in February. So keep your eyes on the emails from Samy's Education. And if you would want to catch one of those beginning classes, feel free to sign up for those. And the other thing that I want to pass out to you is if you ever need any one-on-one information, we've been introducing Lumix 1-to-1, where you can get 30 minutes of time with any one of our technical representatives. You can find that at lumix.as.me. Allows you to pick a time on one of our calendars and actually schedule a Zoom call with any of us one-on-one. Mark, were there any more questions?
Sorry, here I am. Is there a couple of good ones? Is there a rule of thumb for how many frames you want to shoot? Say you want a time-lapse task that will take 2 hours. How many frames per minute, per second, total?
Well, you know what's really perfect is like I showed you before. Let me go back to my camera here. Hang on. Let's go to 4. So
and then I did put one of the other people chimed in with a great response too. I mean, I'm going to let you explain it, but there's a program called PhotoPills, P-A-P-I-L-L-S, and I put a link to it. There's a link to it there. It's a phenomenal program for doing these calculations, but Michael's going to give you an overview of it.
What I like to do is this is really simple. You know, PhotoPills will probably give you a much more very accurate way of doing it. But from here, if I can just watch what if I say now, and I tell it, like I said, if I tell it what my interval is and what my number of images are, I can find out when it's going to finish. So if I have a sunset that's going to finish at, say, 7:45, or let's say 7:30, and my images at 1 minute interval at 300 images is going to stop at 7:52, then maybe I've got too much time. I need to reduce my shooting interval, or I need to reduce my image count. Totally, image count is really up to you, how smooth you want to get your images to finish up. So the more images, of course, the larger the storage capacity you're going to need, and a little bit longer for the processing time. It's more just kind of what you decide that you have time for, to be very honest with you. But this will give you a very easy way to kind of get an idea of how long that process is going to take.
And keep in mind that these are going to play back at 30 frames per second. So 300 images equals 10 seconds.
Right.
So if you want your final video to be 10 seconds, shoot 300 pictures. If you want it to be 20 seconds, shoot 600 pictures. And you don't want your time lapse to be terribly long.
That's no teasing. My camera is on daylight savings time. You're right.
Let's see. Yeah, somebody asked there. You saw that question. We talked about that. How do you bail out of a time lapse early? I've been having difficulty doing that with my S1.
Ooh. I have done it a couple of different ways. I have turned the mode dial, and that has canceled it. Or I've actually, there's a pause button. You can tap the pause, or
I think you can also turn the camera off and then back on, can't you?
Yeah.
And it asks, yeah, it asks you if you want to resume.
And then you can say, do I want to resume or do I want to keep going?
No, you can say resume or end. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and then you say end it, and it asks you if you want to make the video, and you make the video. But yeah, that's how you do it on all of our cameras.
Yep.
And let's see, advantages of time lapse versus video versus GoPro.
Oh, I missed that. Sorry, what?
Oh, advantages of time lapse versus video versus a GoPro. They don't all fit in exactly, but let's take the question of time lapse versus shooting a normal video.
Well, time lapse shooting a normal video is going to be just a series of images. So I guess I really kind of don't understand your question.
Well, I think I guess my thought would be a video is going to take a lot longer. The idea of time lapse is you're not taking as many frames.
You can slow down or skip frames, say from a video. But time lapse is going to give you kind of the more creative control for that longer shutter duration. That's the main thing. This video, you really don't want to have shutter durations longer than, say, 60th of a second. You know, it's twice your basic frame rate is the maximum, and you don't want to go too far off of that. So if you're shooting a 24 frame video, your shutter speed is generally locked in. You want to be at 24 frames. You want a shutter speed of 50th of a second. That's how it used to work for the transition of film through the shutter gate. Now, if you're shooting a lot longer, you were not able to do that back in the day. And so, of course, you try to lock into a 50th of a second. By using time lapse, we're able to use, 1 second, 2 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds, long exposures, and then create still that same slow-mo by having a series of long exposures as individual frames.
And then the other question I ask is versus a GoPro. A GoPro will do a video too. Most cameras
They'll all
will.
do the video. They'll all even do time lapse. But
Yeah, time lapse on that. Yes, thank you.
you're getting the ability to work with interchangeable lenses, longer focal lengths, those types of things. If you want to have a shallower depth of field, GoPro is going to have such a wide lens and give you such depth. If you want to get a little more creative with it and have a shallower depth of field, these cameras are going to allow you to have more of a ability to do those types of things and give you that kind of bokeh look or bokeh.
One question here that I've done a lot of research in: what is a good estimate of maximum time people will watch a time lapse until they lose attention span? I find about 20 seconds.
Yeah,
you want these to go quickly, like the ones Michael did of the hyperlapse. Yeah. Do we have time for a couple more questions, Michael?
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody, well, I don't know if this will take too long. Let's see. Somebody asked how to please demo how to set the manual camera settings again. Are you able to hook back up and do that, or?
Yeah.
And then
first of all, you want manual exposure. So your top dial should be on M, manual exposure. That way, then you can dial in exactly what you want for your exposure setting. Let me go here.
Hey, Mike, as you're talking about manual exposure, and you're instructing us to leave it in auto ISO, doesn't that override the manual exposure?
No.
Excellent, thank you. That was one of the questions.
Yep. No, you're using manual exposure to lock in your shutter speed and aperture.
You're basically, like we talked about, locking that aperture from moving, as well as keeping a consistent shutter speed. So your exposure time is exactly accurate all the way through, and you're using the auto ISO to up and down if there are any dramatic changes in light. So here you can see, let's see, am I on 4? Yeah, there we go. So one other thing I wanted to show too is here is where you change in playback mode. This is where we're able to change the record quality. So I can do, as you notice, I've got 30p, 60p, I can shoot 4K 24. I can record these in all these different formats as my final video output. Also the frame rate, like I talked to you before, I had done that one at 7.5 frames, and then the other one I did at 15. Here are the different choices that I have for this video that I just shot, from 24 frames all the way down to 1 frame per second. That is not the frame per second that it's photographed at. That's the frames per second that it's finally generated at. And then you can also change the sequence if you want to reverse it. So rather than the sunset going down, you want the sunset to come up. You can reverse the file to the exact opposite. So starting from backwards from forwards, that type of thing. And so let's go back to manual. So I'm going to do a manual exposure. So I would dial in basically my f-stop and my shutter speed down here where I got something that I would like. Once I've gotten that set, I would definitely make sure that I have auto ISO set by tapping the ISO button on the top of my camera. You can see I have auto ISO. And then I can then go to my time lapse function. Time lapse animation, time lapse shot. I want to start now, meaning once I set up these parameters and then I press the shutter button, it will then start. Here's my shooting intervals. So let's just say we're going to do, let's just make this fun. Let's go, sorry. One more, 1 second. And let's shoot 21 images. And you can see now it's counting 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13. So basically that's how it's set up. Of course, I'm just shooting the tabletop here, so it's nothing really important. But it gives you an idea of how simple that is to set. When it's all done, the camera basically will then come to me and say, do I want to build this file? Time lapse is completed. Do I want to create my video? I just say yes. Again, there's my questions on what the record quality is going to be. I say okay. It tells me it's going to take a minute to create that file. Boom. Of course, I just have a file of not much, but you get an idea of basically how simple this is to do. So easy to do, so simple to do. You can manipulate time very, very easily. Or we can freeze time like we did with the candle. Or we can move through time like we did with Hyperlapse. Or we can pan and tilt and do a motion lapse as well. So many different ways to take your subject and very creatively manipulate time. Do we have any more questions, Mark?
Well, hang in with us for just a second. What resolution and file sizes are you using for the JPEGs?
These are the largest JPEGs that I'm using. So we have a fine and then a smaller. So I use the largest possible. So if I've got a 24 megapixel sensor, I'm shooting a full-size 24 megapixel JPEG that's then set on the fine setting. So the least amount of compression.
Yeah, because you still have all the JPEGs after you've shot this. So I'm like Michael, I like them to be at full resolution in case I want to use one of the single images for something.
Exactly. Maybe I want to use it as a still image. Maybe that sunset turned out to be really beautiful at the end and I want to save that one frame.
Exactly. Let's see, if we're using, oh, somebody asked here, one question. So if you've created a video at 1 frame rate, can you make another video?
Yes. So if you'll notice when I did that playback, I can go back now and I can go back and do it over and over again and I can change it each and every time.
Yeah,
you
go to the playback.
I did that one before where I didn't like the 7.5 frames.
Right.
Motion lapse. So here we thought it was too jumpy. All I did was go back, play that same file again. I could do that today. I could do that tomorrow. I could do it 5 minutes later. I could do it an hour later. Doesn't matter. I go back and just tell it. It pulls up those images as I play back, and I just recreated it at a different frame rate, and thus it gave me that smoother feel. So
right,
yes, I can go back at any time and readjust how in which it was recorded and how in which it's made into a movie so that it plays back in a smoother sequence if I need to.
Right, and that's in the play settings in the menu.
Play menu, correct.
Yeah. I think that's, oh, this is a nice one here. Awesome day with Panasonic Pros. Have sold me on buying a Panasonic for my next camera. So,
oh, love that.
So you're done. You're done for the night, Michael. You're off.
Wait, I got a mission accomplished. That one.
Mission accomplished.
You got that one extra question regarding the manual setting?
I
assume if you don't like auto ISO, how it's looking, you could put it into the manual mode for everything else. Could you use the exposure compensation to make it lighter or darker overall then?
Correct. For your original start point, yes. Because remember, it's going to be the same exposure all the way through. You can't change it once you've started.
But if you do that and you put your ISO on a certain number, it's going to get darker and lighter as it goes. There's going to be nothing to adjust the brightness of the exposure.
Correct.
Good, thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, Michael.
Michael.
I mean, you can shoot aperture priority. You can do things differently. That's not necessarily the only way that it should be done.
No, in fact,
but I found that using auto ISO, manual exposure, manual focus just seems to be the best foolproof way to do it. Believe me, I've done it aperture priority, autofocus, all the exact opposites of what we just talked about, and still got tremendous images. But you know, working with doing these over and over, I find that that's kind of the best foolproof way. of course, there's always other ways of doing it.
Michael, I'm going to go out and shoot some nighttime time-lapse photography tonight.
There you go.
You've got me very excited. And it's so easy. I never knew how easy it actually was.
That's the simple thing. And I guess I've said it over and over in my classes, and I'll just say it one more time. You know, the beautiful thing that I have working for Panasonic is I have the ability to pick up, you know, pretty much whatever I need, whether it's a GH5 or a G9 or an S series or a point and shoot. I have the capability, and I have I'm very, very thankful of that, of being able to pick up pretty much everything and anything. But also, even though I was a professional for many years, Panasonic has never said to me, hey, you have to shoot my gear. So when I first started with them, I kind of thought, well, I'll work with them and I'll work with it. My perfect example is this. I shot a football game with a GH5, and I took all my other Canon gear with me, and I said, I'll shoot the first quarter Panasonic, and then I'll shoot the second and third and fourth quarter with my Canon gear. Well, guess what? I got through the first quarter. I got through the second quarter. I was still shooting GH5. I got to halftime. I saw my images. Everybody else saw my images, and I've never turned back. So that's one of the reasons I really enjoy speaking to everybody and talking about Panasonic, is how simple it makes some of these complex things, and how, I guess, more efficient I can be and create beautiful images with maybe a little bit less work sometimes, and get some really, really amazing results very simply.
Truly impressive. Thank you so much, Michael. And to the rest of the Panasonic team, Mark and Panasonic Pete, thank you for your support and efforts today and tonight. We greatly appreciate it. And to all of those of you who have been watching today, thank you for joining us here at Samy's Camera and Samy's Photo School Holiday Education Event. And a final reminder, our stores are open during the holiday season. We're practicing social distancing protocols in store. We have touchless curbside pickup available outside the stores. And as always, 24/7 on Samys.com for your holiday and photographic needs this season. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to the Panasonic team. Happy holidays, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody. Be safe.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.